Merci beaucoup Miguel, Sophie-Jeanne pour votre invitation et Mathilde Bois pour l'organisation. Je vais donc donner le texte en anglais, mais je répondrai bien sûr aux questions en français et j'essaierai de dire quelque chose, des petits résumés ponctuels en français pendant la lecture si je peux y arriver. C'est 30 ans aux États-Unis, ça abîme un peu la pratique de la langue. I would like to speak today about the expression of phenomenology of the inapparent, which is an expression that Heidegger used to designate the most proper sense of phenomenology in his last seminar in Zähringen in 1973. Phenomenology is traditionally considered to be a thought of presence, assigned to a phenomenon that is identified with a present being or with an object for consciousness. The very term phenomenon has its roots in the Greek verb phanestai, to appear or to show itself. As a middle voice construction of phino, phanestai means to bring to light, to place in brightness, where something can become visible and manifest. The phenomena are thus the totality of what lies in the light of day or can be brought to light. One may conclude from these passages that by definition a phenomenon is what appears and shows itself to a perceiver or to a consciousness. The phenomenon would be synonymous with presence itself, with what manifests itself in a presence that can be attested in a conscious experience. Consciousness being itself nothing except a form of presence and form to self. Phenomenology would then be a thought of presence, and of presence to consciousness, itself a form of presence. However, I will suggest today that phenomenology is haunted by the presence of a certain unappearing dimension, the inapparent, a claim that, as I just mentioned, was made by Heidegger in his last seminar in 1973, when he characterized the most proper sense of phenomenology as a phenomenology of the inapparent. Such inapparent names a certain alterity that escapes presentation, and yet it is said to belong to the phenomenon and to phenomenology as such. I will thus attempt to show in what sense the inapparent plays a role in phenomenality and in phenomenology, and what we could think of by this expression of a phenomenology of the inapparent. I will suggest at the end, only briefly in the conclusion, that this gives a certain ethical scope to phenomenology as well, because this inapparent will bring out a certain ethical, in a certain sense, response. As I just mentioned, the very presence of the inapparent can be traced in Heidegger's very definition of the phenomenon, and indeed the phenomenology, a claim which at first may seem paradoxical and even go against the very definition that Heidegger gives of the phenomenon in paragraph 7 of Being and Time. He says, thus we must keep in mind that the expression phenomenon signified that which shows itself, in itself, the manifest. Now we should clarify from the outset that a phenomenon for Heidegger, that is the phenomenon with which phenomenology is concerned, cannot be understood or reduced to an empirical intuition or an ontical given or to a present being. In fact, Heidegger, in paragraph 7, rejects explicitly the Kantian notion of an empirical intuition to designate the phenomenon with which phenomenology is concerned. Why? Because the phenomenon is approached by Heidegger in its verbal sense, that is, as that which shows itself or manifests itself of itself and from itself. The phenomenon is defined as, quote, the self showing itself in itself, and therefore not simply what has been shown or the ontical given or the entity. The term phenomenon thus immediately refers to the event of a self-showing, and the given is consequently assigned to the event of its giving. A phenomenological approach to the phenomenon is thus not turned towards the ontic phenomenon, but rather towards the event of its manifestation. And this is why phenomenology for Heidegger is not about beings, but about the being of beings. For Heidegger, as we know, phenomenology is the very method of ontology. And the phenomena are to be referred not to a constituting consciousness, but to the event of being as such. Unlike his former mentor Husserl, Heidegger defines phenomenology in relation to ontology and giving us access to the being of beings. Quote, from Being and Time, with regard to its subject matter, phenomenology is the science of the being of entities, ontology. And as we know in reverse, ontology is possible only as phenomenology. So this is a crucial circle. Indeed, Heidegger stresses that phenomenology is concerned about the being of the phenomena, their modes of givenness or of happening. Phenomenology is concerned with the phenomena understood as the event of being. In this ontological understanding of phenomenology, the emphasis shifts from phenomena understood as things to the being of these phenomena, their happening or eventfulness, from phenomena to phenomenality. To cite a passage from Jean-Luc Marion, phenomenology, he says, consists in showing not the appearance itself, but the appearing in the appearance. Marion writes, if in the realm of metaphysics it is a question of proving, in the phenomenological realm it is not a question of simply showing, since in this case apparition could still be the object of a gaze, therefore mere appearance, but rather of letting apparition show itself in its appearance according to its appearing, end quote. So such phenomenology will bring to light the appearing of appearances, what we could call, following François Lasture, the condition of all appearing. Now here one glimpses for the first time the presence of an inapparent in phenomenology. The phenomenon is not the appearance, but the appearing of an appearance that precisely because itself is not an appearance, does not appear. Because such appearing is itself not an appearance, because in other words it does not appear, it could be said to be invisible. Although we are speaking here probably of an invisibility of the world and not a metaphysical or transcendental invisibility. Merleau-Ponty wrote famously in The Visible and the Invisible that the invisible is, quote, not a de facto invisible like an object hidden by another, and not an absolute invisible which would have nothing to do with the visible. Rather, it is the invisible of this world, that which inhabits this world, sustains it and renders it visible, its own interior possibility, the being of this being, end quote. The invisible for Merleau-Ponty is thus an idea that is not the contrary of the sensible, but rather its, quote, lining and depth. There is thus an invisibility of the visible, an invisibility of phenomenality itself, concealed and nonetheless sheltered in the visible. By understanding being in distinction from beings, Heidegger allows us to approach being itself as an event, and the event of presence. Now this event seems to harbor for him a certain withdrawal, as the very term Anwesenheit reveals. The An in Anwesen or Anwesenheit suggests a coming into present, a movement, a motion from concealment to unconcealment, from withdrawal to visibility. In other words, a withdrawal seems to affect each time the event of presence. This is why Heidegger could write that the phenomenon, precisely as that which is to be made phenomenologically visible, does not show itself. In Being and Time, he writes, and just because the phenomena are approximately and for the most part not given, there is need for phenomenology. So phenomenology is rooted in the inapparent of the phenomena. The very concept of phenomenology, he says, insofar as this is defined as letting something be seen, necessarily implies the withdrawal of the phenomenon. This is why the phenomenon of phenomenology cannot be that which is apparent or manifest, but that which is which doesn't show itself, although this not showing itself belongs to what shows itself. So it is not something behind it or beyond it. For Heidegger says in a very important passage of Being and Time, in paragraph 7, that behind the phenomena of phenomenology there is essentially nothing. So there is nothing behind the phenomenon, but there is an unapparent in the phenomenon. What doesn't appear in the phenomenon is there's not some noumenal reality of any kind, transcendent to the phenomenon, or that would be hidden behind the phenomenon, but a dimension that belongs to it. This is the quote from Heidegger. What is it that must then be called a phenomenon? in a distinctive sense. What is it that by its very essence is necessarily the theme whenever we exhibit something explicitly? Manifestly, it is something that proximity, and for the most part, does not show itself at all. It is something that lies hidden in contrast to that which proximity, for the most part, does show itself. But at the same time, it is something that belongs to what shows itself, and it belongs to it essentially so as to constitute its meaning and its ground. This is in Being and Time already that the phenomenology is understood as a phenomenology of the inapparent. Now, for Heidegger in Being and Time, what does not appear is the being of the phenomenon. He writes, yet that which remains hidden, or which relapses and gets covered up again, or which shows itself only in disguise, is just not this or that entity, but rather the being of entities. End quote. Now let us note here that later on, in a passage on the Weather language, Heidegger said that Ereignis is what is inapparent, and he even says Ereignis is the least apparent of such inapparent. But in Being and Time, it is still understood as the being of beings. This accounts, in any case, for Heidegger's late pronouncement in 1973. Phenomenology, in its very essence, is a phenomenology of what doesn't appear, a phenomenology of the inapparent. This accounts for, of course, the method of destruction or deconstruction, which needs to go through this opacity or withdrawal, and it therefore structures the very approach that Heidegger first took in his work of the deconstruction of the concealments led by metaphysics. This is also why there is a need in phenomenology for Heidegger for a genuine phenomenological forcing, the goal of which is to elucidate, bring to light, uncover that which remains hidden, covered, or dissimulated. This is the violence of thought that Heidegger assumes. Thought is violent because it goes against the concealment in the phenomena. The necessity of this philosophical violence turn against the violence, shall we say, the original violence of self-concealment, is described in the early courses, where Heidegger talks about how life is characterized by a constant moving away from itself, a certain runance, and thought understood as counter-runance, going against the movement of life that goes against itself. So life goes against itself in self-withdrawal, self-concealment, and thinking is a movement that goes against and counter the motion of life that goes against itself. A double countering, if you will, in thinking. Thinking begins, in these early writings, in life's self-estrangement or expropriation from itself. And it is itself a part of this movement of life, a sort of counter-movement to this event of self-withdrawal. Heidegger thus writes of the constant struggle of factical philosophical interpretation against its own factical runance, a struggle that accompanies the process of the actualization of philosophizing. Phenomenological interpretation manifests by its very essence, he says, also a counter-movement. The violence of interpretation thus responds to the violence of the self-estrangement of life and goes against it. In Being and Time, the necessity of this violence is also taken up by Heidegger in terms of its hermeneutical situation. He says the ontological interpretation of this being, Dasein, must go against its own tendency to conceal and can only be won by following an opposite course from the tendency that distances Dasein from its being by throwing it towards being. He writes, the laying bare of Dasein's primordial being must rather be wrested from Dasein by following the opposite course from that taken by the falling ontological tendency of interpretations. The existential analytic thus recognizes and assumes its phenomenological violence. Thought, then, phenomenology, is a struggle with this obscurity or opacity of withdrawal, of this inapparence or this concealment. Phenomenology is a wrestling with the inapparent. Now the question is whether this is thinkable or unthinkable, what it is wrestling with. but I have unthinkable in parentheses, so we can take it up again. The entire phenomenological problematic is thus rooted in the concealment of being, its non-appearing. In later texts, for instance in the essay Moira, Heidegger speaks of how the play of the calling, brightening, expanding light is not actually visible. That play, he writes, shines imperceptibly, like morning light upon the quiet splendors of lilies in a field of roses in a garden. Being withdraws to only let the being appear. As Heidegger puts it in a passage from Anaximander's saying, and repeating that statement twice in that essay, studying a veritable law of the givenness of being, quote, by revealing itself in the being, being withdraws. Heidegger continues that being is the mystery behind this. Being itself withdraws into its truth. It saves itself in its truth and conceals itself in such shelter. He also clarified, being does not come to the light of its own essence. In the appearance of being as such, being itself stays away. The truth of being escapes us. It remains forgotten. Now, with respect to this forgetting, there is a need to make a distinction. There are two kinds of forgetting in Heidegger's thought. This I take from the lecture on time and being in the summary of the discussion they had afterwards. There is first the concealment proper to metaphysics, the oblivion of being, and there is the concealment proper to Eragnis. Those are two different concealments. Quote, the concealment which belongs to metaphysics as its limit must belong to Eragnis itself, he writes. That means, he continues, that the withdrawal which characterized metaphysics in the form of the oblivion of being now shows itself as the dimension of concealment itself, unquote. Now the difference between the two concealments lies in whether the concealment itself is concealed or not. Whereas in metaphysics there is a forgetting of the forgetting, since the withdrawal of being itself withdraws. Metaphysics, he writes, is the oblivion of being, and that means the history of the concealment and withdrawal of that which gives being, meaning Eragnis. In the thinking of the truth of being, such concealment is meditated upon and remembered. He writes, now this concealment does not conceal itself. Rather, the attention of thinking is concerned with it. So there is a way in which thinking can pay attention to the inapparent, and there is a way in which that inapparent is forgotten as inapparent. Clearly, Heidegger determines the thinking of being, and you could say as early as being and time, as a remembering, which is itself to be understood, paradoxically, as a standing in oblivion, as a remembering of the oblivion. In other words, remembering is not the overcoming of oblivion, but its guarding. One remembers that there is forgetting and nothing else. One meditates the inapparent and the withdrawal. Heidegger's thought, it seems to us, is grappling then with this irreducible concealment and expropriation, which lies at the heart of the event of presence and being. And this is why, as we noted, Heidegger characterized phenomenology as a phenomenology of the inapparent. He writes, 1973, we are here in the domain of the inapparent, presencing itself presences. In other words, we're talking about a pure event of being. Phenomenology is a path that leads the way before, and it lets that before which it is led show itself. This phenomenology is a phenomenology of the inapparent. In 1963, Heidegger continues and insists that phenomenology is assigned to a mystery. He writes, but in what is most its own, phenomenology is not a school. It is the possibility of thinking, at times changing, and only thus persisting, of corresponding to the claim of what is to be thought. If phenomenology is thus experienced and retained, it can disappear as a designation in favor of the matter of thinking, whose manifestedness remains a mystery behind us. We see here how the future and possibility of thinking is associated with the presence of the inapparent, of the mystery that emerges in the event of being. And we see how thinking originates from this inapparent. This conjunction of the mystery and the opening of a future for thought is best captured in a famous passage from what is called Thinking, where Heidegger states, and we heard that this morning, most thought-provoking in our thought-provoking time is that we are still not thinking. We are still not thinking because what must be thought about turns away from the human being and withdraws from him. In fact, being, Heidegger says, happens by and in withdrawing. This is how the event of being occurs. It is the event of a withdrawal. Being is the withdrawal. Being withdraws. And from such a withdrawal, and staying away, it calls us to think. The future of thought arises out of the withdrawal of being. Again, when it's called thinking, Heidegger writes, whatever withdraws refuses arrival. But withdrawing is not nothing. Withdrawal is an event. In fact, what withdraws may even concern and claim man more essentially than anything present that strikes and touches him. The event of withdrawal is thus what makes us think. Heidegger writes again, what withdraws from us draws us along by its very withdrawal, whether or not we become aware of it immediately or at all. It is as if the future of thought and the origin of thought was harbored in the withdrawal that refuses thinking. Thinking must first learn what remains reserved and in store for thinking to get involved in. It prepares its own transformation in this learning, as if the future itself of thought lodged in what is held in reserve, as it was only by dwelling in the mystery that the future becomes possible. Now, let me gesture in conclusion to that ethical scope of the question that I mentioned at the beginning, and which I had to really summarize very briefly for lack of time. So I have another half hour for a longer paper where I will try to develop not only the notion of the inapparent in phenomenology, but also the ethical scope of this inapparent. So I will just simply briefly mention it in closing. First of all, this inapparent in phenomenology is not proper to Heidegger himself. One finds it in Levinas, for instance, because you find, for instance, in Levinas, when he describes the face, which is the object of ethics for Levinas, he says that the face does not appear, and that the face is invisible. And Levinas, in several texts, otherwise than being in some interviews, insists on that the face is not seen, or rather, that in the face, what is seen is its invisibility. So it's a matter of seeing the invisible as a way of responding to the other. So one could show how the origin of ethics, at least for Levinas, is the inapparence of the face. And we could go to other thinkers, of course, Merleau-Ponty I mentioned earlier, but I think it would be worthwhile to develop this thread of the inapparent in phenomenology and see how the different versions may converge or not. Now, of course, Derrida, and I don't know if we want to put Derrida as a phenomenologist, I leave it open, but he definitely works in phenomenology, or works with it, or against it, but he's concerned with phenomenology. And Derrida, of course, evokes in his letter writings what he calls an ethics of the secret. And it's relevant to our talk today because the French secret translates Heidegger's Geheimnis. So when Derrida translates Geheimnis, he translates it as le secret, et il parle d'une éthique du secret. And Derrida develops a whole philosophy of the secret in several texts, in which he explains that there is no knowledge of the secret, no knowledge possible of the secret by definition, but that there is, he says, an ethics of the secret, a response and a responsibility for the secret. Indeed, the demand for the revealing of a secret, the demand, for instance, that the other confesses, that he or she explain him and herself and reveal his or her secret, may be, he says, the greatest violence. Quote, is there any worse violence than that which consists in calling for the response, demanding that one give an account of everything, and preferably thematically? In fact, the secret is non-thematizable and non-phenomenalizable. The secret is not a phenomenon in the sense of what can become present, although its inappearance, because the secret doesn't appear, does not mean that it belongs to some noumenal ring either. Not locatable, not presentable, not knowable. Derrida insists that the secret must be the object of respect. One must respect the secret, not do violence to its withdrawal, its non-appearing. He writes, nowadays there is perhaps an ethical and political duty to respect the secret, a certain kind of right to a certain kind of secret, end quote. The lack of respect for the secret is a quest for total transparency and control, the sign of any totalitarianism, which can also, of course, as we know, use and instrumentalize secrets. Quote, the totalitarian vocation is manifested as soon as this respect is lost. All the same, and this is where the difficulty comes in, there are also forms of abuse in relation to the secret, political exploitations of the state secret, like the exploitations of reasons of state and police and other archives. Well, I could continue with this. In Heidegger's thinking, to go back to Heidegger in closing, one finds indeed this responsibility to a secret developed in his thought, which I've argued elsewhere entails a major thought of responsibility. But responsibility for Heidegger is a responsibility to the event of being insofar as it withdraws, and is therefore a responsibility for a secret. The response to the call, whether the call of conscience in Being and Time or the address of being in letter writings, is always a response to what remains inappropriable and withdrawing in such calls. And we could show that in the call of conscience fairly simply, but maybe we can discuss it later. In its very eventfulness, being withdraws. It is the mystery. Such a withdrawal, Heidegger tells us, calls us. Responsibility to being would then be this responsibility to the secret and the inappropriable. Responsibility becomes the carrying of the inappropriability or unpresentability, unappearance or secret of being. This secret of being represents an unappearance that constantly haunts phenomenology and to which it belongs as to its very possibility, whether it knows it or not.